Echoes of the End. In the biting cold of 1683, the village of Aurenfeld was buried in snow, hidden under the shadow of huge mountains. The atmosphere had a feeling of abandonment, the kind that clings to places that time itself seems to have deserted. Aurenfeld may be small, but its people lived in quiet fear of all that lingered just beyond their comprehension. Among them was Elias Carter, a man whose curiosity often trod paths better left unexplored. Elias was a historian by passion, but his interests veered towards the forbidden, objects and texts from bygone eras that others deemed cursed or forgotten. His latest obsession was a book, The Final Chime. Legends spoke of the book as a relic from a time when the earth itself trembled beneath the weight of an unseen power. It was said to be the key to understanding the echoes of the end, an ancient phrase that none dared to decipher aloud. The book, however, was not within easy reach. Its last known resting place was a decrepit chapel on the outskirts of the village, a place avoided even by the bravest. Elias's quest began one frost-bitten evening, when he visited the home of Ewald Graf, an aged villager who was said to know more about the chapel than anyone else. Ewald was a frail man, his hands trembling as he tended to the fire in his dimly lit cabin. "You seek what should not be sought," Ewald whispered when Elias mentioned the book. His voice was low, but his tone carried the weight of countless warnings ignored. "The Final Chime is just a book, Ewald," Elias said, though unease gnawed at him. "Books can't harm anyone." Ewald's eyes, clouded by age yet sharp with dread, locked onto Elias. "It is not the book itself. It is what it awakens. The bells, Elias. The bells have been silent for centuries, and they must remain so. To disturb them is to summon what lies beyond our world." Elias left Ewald's cabin with more questions than answers, the determination within him only strengthened by the old man's cryptic words. As the wind howled through the village that night, he spent his hours poring over notes, outlining his journey to the chapel. Elias headed out the following morning. The track leading to the chapel was a treacherous one that cut through dense forests with snow hanging heavy on the skeletal branches. An unnatural stillness pervaded the air as he approached the ruins. The birds even seemed to shun the place. The chapel stood in disrepair, its stone walls cracked and overgrown with ivy. The once grand bell tower loomed above, its bells hidden from view. Elias hesitated, feeling the weight of countless unseen eyes watching him. Inside, the chapel was a mosaic of decay and forgotten grandeur. Faded murals adorned the walls, depicting scenes of a world torn asunder by cataclysmic forces. At the altar, a pedestal stood, and upon it lay a book bound in leather so dark it seemed to drink in the light. As Elias reached for the book, a low hum reverberated through the air. He froze, his breath visible in the icy stillness. The hum grew louder, becoming a whisper that seemed to come from the walls themselves. "Turn back," the whispers urged, their voices overlapping in a chaotic chorus. "The bells must not ring again." Elias's hand trembled as he grasped the book. The moment his fingers touched its surface, the whispers stopped and fell silent. He looked around, half expecting some unseen force to strike him down, but nothing happened. He clutched the book and fled from the chapel, his mind racing with possibilities. That night, as Elias examined the book in his study, the first bell tolled. It was a deep, resonant sound that seemed to shake the very foundations of the village. Startled, Elias rushed to his window, but the village square was empty. A second toll followed, then a third. By the time the fourth bell rang, Elias realized the sound was coming from the chapel. Panic set in, and he remembered Ewald's warning. He tried to convince himself it wasn't his imagination, yet the bells continued, louder and more haunting with each passing minute. When the 10th bell rang, the whispers came back, not faint as they had been before, but loud and furious, as if the very air was alive with anger. "You have awakened them," the voices hissed. "The end begins." By morning, the village was awash with fear. Not a soul had slept, and they all swore they heard the bells. But when several men dared to take the path to the chapel, they found the tower empty. The bells had vanished. Elias, meanwhile, was absorbed by the book. Its pages were filled with symbols and scripts he could not decipher, but one phrase kept on reappearing. "The bells shall toll, and the echoes shall rise." Ewald visited him that evening, his frailty replaced by a steely resolve. "You've done it now," he said, his voice trembling. "The bells are not just metal and stone. They are the guardians of the end, and you, Elias, have set them free." The night of Yestereven had cast a heavy veil of fear over Aurenfeld. The mysterious tolling of the chapel bells rang through the villages, even when morning tints already colored the snow on the peaked summits of yonder hills. None could tell from whence came that sudden clang of hitherto silent church bells. Far worse yet, the party that hastened to the chapel found that there was nothing to look for. For Elias Carter, the tolling heralded something much darker than that. The whispers of the chapel, the enigmatic markings in the final chime, and the words of Ewald sent shivers down his spine. Still, he could not resist his insatiable curiosity. It was as if the historian in him wanted to know even if the answers lay within the shadows of an old curse. Rumors were running amok in the village by midday. Whispers abounded in the air, saying Elias was meddling with forces beyond human understanding. Some claimed that he had unleashed the wrath of the spirits that guarded the bells. Others thought that something worse had been summoned. Elias avoided the village square, retreating to his study, where the cursed book lay open on his desk. He had spent hours poring over its pages, trying to decipher the cryptic symbols that seemed to shift when he looked away. One phrase, however, appeared in clear Latin: "Audite sonos et videbunt finem." "Hear the sounds, and they shall see the end." Elias wrote the phrase in his journal, its ominous tone sending a shiver down his spine. A knock at the door startled him. He opened it to find Father Anselm, the village priest, flanked by two villagers. Anselm's face was grim, his usual warmth replaced by suspicion. "Elias," Anselm said, his voice steady but cold, "the villagers are frightened. They believe you've brought this upon us. I must ask, what did you find in the chapel?" Elias hesitated, weighing whether to tell the truth. "I found a book," he admitted, stepping aside to let Anselm in. "But I don't understand what's happening. The bells, they shouldn't have rung." Anselm's eyes fell on the open book. His face darkened as he muttered a prayer under his breath. "This is no ordinary text," he said. "It is a relic of the dark times, when men sought power through unholy means. Whatever this book contains, it is not meant for us." The priest pleaded with Elias to burn the book, but Elias refused. "If this book has caused the bells, destroying it will not do any good. I must know its secrets." Anselm departed unwillingly, cautioning Elias to be careful. The villagers, he said, were getting restless, and fear was easily turned into violence. That night, the bells tolled once more. This time, the peal was answered by a low, guttural hum that seemed to come from the very earth itself. Elias stood by his window, watching as villagers began to gather in the square, their faces pale with terror. Suddenly, a scream pierced the night. The crowd turned to see Margarita, a young woman, pointing towards the edge of the forest. "It's Hans!" she cried. "He was there, and now he's gone." A search party was organized immediately, their torches cutting through the darkness as they ventured into the forest. Elias watched from a distance, a sinking feeling in his gut. The whispers had returned, faint but unmistakable, weaving through the cold night air. Hours later, when they returned, their faces said it all. Hans was gone, but they told of strange markings in the snow, circles and runes etched into the frozen earth as if by an unknown hand. Determined to find the truth, Elias delved deeper into the final chime. He noticed that some symbols in the book were exactly the same as those described by the search party. The book seemed alive, its pages exuding a faint warmth as he traced the lines of text. With each passing hour, Elias felt a weird sensation, a tugging at the edges of his consciousness, as if the book was calling to him. His vision blurred, and for a moment, he saw flashes of a world consumed by fire and shadow. Towering figures loomed over desolate landscapes, their forms obscured by smoke and ash. He snapped out of the trance, gasping for breath. The book had shown him something, an echo of what is to come, perhaps. But why? And how was he connected to it? The next day, Elias visited Ewald once more. Still, the old man was reluctant to speak until he finally obliged. "The book you carry is older than this village," Ewald said. "It's tied to the bells, yes, but also something far worse. These are harbingers, Elias. When they chime, they call forth watchers, entities that exist outside our comprehension." Ewald spoke of an ancient ritual performed by a long-forgotten sect. The bells were meant to bind the watchers, keeping them dormant. But if disturbed, they would awaken, bringing destruction in their wake. "Why me?" Elias asked. "Why now?" "Because you are curious," Ewald replied. "And curiosity is their key." That evening, Elias found a mark on his wrist. A tiny spiral curl, like the designs in the book. Panicked, he tried to rub it away. However, it only faded somewhat, its edges shimmering dimly in the gloom. The murmurs turned to louder whispers, even taking shape in coherent words. "The first has fallen, the second shall rise." Elias felt a presence in the room, a cold shadow pressing against him. He turned, but nothing was there. In the village, another disappearance occurred. This time, it was Margarita herself. The villagers, now in a frenzy, demanded answers. Their fear turned to anger, and they marched towards Elias's home. As the mob pounded on his door, Elias clutched the book, its pages fluttering as if moved by an unseen wind. The bells tolled once more, their mournful sound reverberating through the night. The third peal shattered the fragile quiet of Aurenfeld at dawn's edge. This time it was angry, not somber. A deep, sonorous clang that rolled across the valley and echoed among the mountains to send frightened birds bursting out of treetops. Weary and desolate, the villagers swarmed out into the square. Their pale faces glistened like moonlit candles. Elias sat up with a start, the sound pushing on his chest like a physical weight. The spiral on his wrist throbbed as if it had been seared by an iron brand. His vision blurred, and for a moment, he thought he could see shadowy figures standing at the edges of his room, their outlines indistinct but menacing. The whispers were louder now, overlapping voices that spoke in a language Elias couldn't understand. They seemed to come from the very walls, from beneath the floorboards, and from the icy wind that slipped through the cracks in his windows. He gripped the final chime tightly. Its pages rustled, as if in response to the bedlam outside. The book was alive. There was no denying it now, and it was dragging him deeper into its twisted history. By morning, the villagers had found something worse than the tolling of the bells. Gone was Margarita, the young woman who screamed about Hans's disappearance. Her house stood silent, the door ajar and a single faint trail of footprints leading out into the snow. The trail abruptly ended at the edge of the forest, where strange symbols had been carved into the bark of the trees. The villagers stared at the markings, their fear growing as they recognized the same spirals and runes Elias had described. "She's gone," one of the men whispered, his voice trembling, "just like Hans." Soon the village square was abuzz with accusations. Some blamed Elias outright, calling him a sorcerer who had cursed the village with his curiosity. Others spoke of the bells as an ancient punishment, a warning that the villagers had ignored for too long. Father Anselm tried to restore order, his booming voice cutting through the chaos. "Enough!" he shouted. "We will find Margaretha, but we must remain calm. This fear will destroy us faster than any curse." Anselm's words did little to soothe the crowd. Desperation was setting in, and it would only be a matter of time before that desperation turned violent. Elias knew he could not remain in the village. The mob would come for him sooner or later, and he was determined to wait for no man. He packed his satchel with the essentials: a lantern, matches, a small knife, and the final chime. The biting cold wind struck his face as he stepped out. The village was curiously quiet, the deserted streets dotted only by faint flickers of lantern light in windows. He had decided to go to the forest, seeking the truth behind the bells, the book, and the disappearances. The forest was darker than he had ever seen it. The trees seemed to close in on him, their branches twisted like skeletal fingers. He held the lantern high. Its weak light barely penetrated the shadows. The whispers were louder here, a constant murmur that seemed to come from the very earth beneath his feet. He followed the carvings on the trees into greater and greater intricacies of pattern the further inside he went. The air seemed to grow cold in increments, and Elias felt himself increasingly observed. Every so often he'd catch a glimpse of movement out of the corner of his eye, dark shapes that vanished as soon as he glanced at them. After what seemed like hours, Elias found a clearing. In the middle of it stood a crumbling stone tower, its silhouette stark against the moonlit sky. The tower was ancient, its walls covered in moss and ivy, and its door hung crookedly on rusted hinges. Elias took steps slowly forward. The whispers grew louder at every step. The spiral on his wrist burned now brightly, casting a light upon the carvings on the stones of the tower. They matched the symbols of the final chime perfectly. Inside, it was thick with dust, and the stench of rot was heavy in the air. Faint beams of moonlight streamed through cracks in the walls, casting the room with an otherworldly light. The altar stood at the room's center, and suspended over it was a gargantuan bell with a tarnished surface bearing the runes. Elias felt a shiver as he realized the bell was exactly like the one in the book. He walked closer, his lantern throwing long shadows across the floor. As he reached the altar, he saw something odd, a small pile of objects placed carefully at its base. A silver locket, a child's wooden toy, a tattered scarf. They were offerings left by someone, or something, that worshipped the bell. Elias's hand trembled as he opened the final chime. The pages seemed to turn on their own, stopping at a passage that hadn't been there before. The text was in Latin, but he could somehow understand it. To summon the forgotten, one must toll the bell. To silence them, one must offer their name. The room grew colder, and Elias felt the presence of something behind him. He turned slowly, the lantern shaking in his grasp. A figure stood at the edge of the room, its form shrouded in shadow. It was tall and gaunt, with hollow eyes that seemed to pierce through the darkness. It took a step forward, and Elias stumbled back, his heart pounding in his chest. The whispers grew loud, reaching a deafening crescendo, and the bell above the altar began to vibrate with a low, resonant toll, a sound that seemed to shake the very foundation of the tower. The figure drew nearer, its face now in view in the faint light. Not human. Its skin was ashen, its mouth twisted into a grimace that seemed to stretch unnaturally wide. Elias clutched the book to his chest, his mind racing. The text had said to offer a name, but whose name? His own? Or someone else's? As the figure reached out, Elias did the only thing he could think of. He spoke a name, the name of the village itself. Aurenfeld, he whispered, his voice trembling. The figure froze, its hollow eyes narrowing. For a moment, the whispers ceased, and the bell went silent. Then, with a deafening roar, the figure vanished, leaving Elias alone in the tower. Elias stumbled out of the tower, his mind reeling. The whispers were gone, but the spiral on his wrist still burned. He looked back at the tower, its shadow looming over the clearing. He now understood that the bells were not just warnings. They were a form of curse, tied inextricably to the very existence of the village, and he had merely started unearthing their dark secrets. Silence in Aurenfeld was a fragile thing, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves or the distant cry of an animal. But in the minds of these people, the silence of Hans, Margareta, or maybe even the death of the soul of a little village was deafening. The third toll of the bell cast some darkness over their lives now, as they waited in awe-cursed terror of what would soon become. Elias, however, could not wait. The encounter in the ancient tower had shaken him to his core, but it had also given him clarity. The curse tied to Aurenfeld was old, far older than any of the villagers knew. And if the cryptic words in the final chime were true, the village itself might be the key to unraveling this dark mystery. The spiral mark on Elias's wrist began to change. It had been an indistinct outline, barely visible. Now it shone with a faint silver light. Its edges writhed and shifted as if alive. It throbbed at night, the agony shooting through his arm like molten fire. The mark was a connection, a tether to the curse. Elias could not free himself from it, and on an unconscious level, he didn't want to. The truth, no matter how horrifying it was his only way out. But the villagers were becoming restless. Rumors of guilt and accusation had begun to swirl again, and at the heart of them was Elias. His withdrawn demeanor, his fixation on the bells, and his ownership of the odd book made him a ready target. Father Anselm came to Elias on the fourth day after the last toll. The priest's face was pale, his eyes heavy with worry. "Elias," he started, his voice shaking. "The people, they are afraid. They believe you have brought this upon us." Elias looked at the priest. "Do you?" Anselm paused, the heaviness of his robe suddenly oppressive. "I do not know. But I do know that this village cannot survive much more of this. If there is anything you know, anything that can help, you must tell me." Elias hesitated. He wanted to tell the priest everything he found in that tower, the thing that happened. But the part of him made him believe no one, least of all this man of faith, would believe him. "I am on it," Elias said finally. "Just give me some time." "I am not certain we have enough time for it," said Anselm, who stiffened before nodding. That night, Elias returned to the forest. The village had grown suffocating, its narrow streets filled with suspicious glances and hushed accusations. For all its horrors, the tower felt oddly welcoming, a place where he could confront the darkness head-on. The journey through the forest was different this time. The air was colder, the shadows deeper. The trees seemed to lean closer together, their branches forming a canopy that blocked out the moonlight. When Elias reached the clearing, he froze. The tower was no longer empty. A figure stood in the doorway, its back turned to him. Tall and thin, a silhouette sharp against the pale light of the clearing. Elias felt his first impulse was to run, but he stayed frozen where he stood. Familiar yet absolutely alien, the figure appeared. As he stepped forward, the figure turned its head. It was Margareta. Her eyes were hollow, her skin pale and stretched tight over her bones. The spirals were etched into her flesh, glowing faintly like Elias's mark. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out, only a low guttural sound that sent shivers down Elias's spine. "Margareta," he whispered, taking a cautious step forward. "It's me, Elias." Her head tilted, the motion sharp and unnatural. She took a step toward him, and Elias realized with a sinking feeling that this was no longer the woman he had once known. Before Elias could react, Margareta lunged. Her movements were impossibly fast. her hands clawing at him with a strength that belied her frail appearance. Elias stumbled back, raising his lantern to ward her off. It repelled the light, and she let out a scream that seemed to tear the air apart within the clearing. Elias's heart hammered, fumbling for the knife within his satchel. He felt his hands uncontrollably shake as he reached in. The confrontation was brief, but brutal. Margarita's attacks were relentless, her hollow eyes fixed on Elias with a burning intensity. But as the first rays of dawn broke through the trees, she suddenly stopped. Her body convulsed, and with a final anguished cry, she collapsed to the ground. Elias stared at her lifeless form, his mind racing. Spirals on her skin had faded, and only the scars of transformation were left behind. He didn't know whether he should feel relief or horror. Elias took Margarita's body back to the village, but he knew that the villagers wouldn't understand. He hardly understood it himself. Father Anselm was waiting for him at the edge of the forest, his face a mixture of relief and fear. "You found her," he said, his voice soft. "I did," Elias replied, his tone hollow. "But she's gone. She's been gone for a long time." The priest nodded, his eyes falling on the scars that marked Margarita's body. "This is not the work of man," he murmured. "This is something far older, far darker." The fourth toll of the bell came that night. It was louder than ever before, a sound that seemed to shake the very earth. The villagers screamed, their terror palpable as the ground beneath their feet began to tremble. Elias stood in the square, clutching the final chime. The mark on his wrist burned brighter than ever, its light casting eerie shadows on the walls of the buildings around him. He knew now that the bells were not just a warning, they were a summons. And whatever they were calling was growing closer. The night was heavy with unnatural silence. It weighed down Aurenfeld like a choking shroud, punctuated only by the faint echoes of the fourth toll still resounding in the villagers' minds. Elias, however, knew that this was not the calm before the storm. The mark on his wrist burned brighter, and its scorching light illuminated the dark little room. His heart was racing as he flipped the brittle pages of the final chime. There was no denying it now. The tolls sounded like a countdown, and the last one was near. The book hinted at this horrifying truth. The bells did not only warn them of doom, they summoned it. The ancient pact, which had once shielded Aurenfeld, was unraveling, and whatever lurked beyond their reality was breaking through. Elias felt the weight of the village's fate on his shoulders. If he failed, they would all perish, or worse. As the first rays of dawn crept into the sky, Elias succumbed to exhaustion. Sleep claimed him, but it was not restful. He found himself standing in a vast, featureless void, the air thick with an otherworldly chill. Before him, the tower loomed impossibly tall and dark. Obscured faces peered out, but the eyes gleamed red. They chanted words that Elias couldn't understand in a language that was the sum of all other languages and produced a chilling symphony by blending together. He started shaking a moment when a shuddering ground and great clappers from above the tower materialized. Ancient, cracked in several places, its spiral etchings were reflected around his wrist. The slow swinging of the bell followed. The toll rang out, a sound so powerful that it seemed to tear the void apart. The shadows surged forward, their forms shifting and growing as they reached for Elias. He awoke with a gasp, his body drenched in sweat. The vision was no mere dream, it was a warning. The final toll was coming, and it would bring an end to everything. The villagers were on the brink of hysteria. The tolls had driven them to paranoia and despair, and now they turned to Father Anselm for answers. The priest, overwhelmed by the chaos, could do little more than offer hollow reassurances. However, there was no time for that among all the panic. He placed some necessary things in his satchel. The final chime, a lantern, a knife, and a vial of holy water Anselm had given him. "Where are you going?" Anselm questioned when he saw Elias was heading to the forest. "To the tower," he said. "I need to end this." Anselm grabbed his arm, his grip surprisingly strong. "You can't face this alone. Whatever is coming is beyond our understanding. It's beyond you." Elias pulled free. "Then pray for me, Father. Pray that I'm enough." The forest was full of unnatural sounds as Elias made his way to the tower. The trees groaned in pain, and the air was heavy with the stench of decay. Shadows flickered at the edges of his vision, but when he turned to look, there was nothing there. As he approached the clearing, the tower was different. It pulsed with a dark energy, and the stones seemed to glow faintly with crimson light. The door that had been sealed when he had last visited was now open. Elias hesitated, his heart pounding in his chest. He knew, however, that there was no turning back. Taking a deep breath, he stepped inside. Inside, it was a maze of spiral staircases and twisting walls. The air reeked of some kind of negative energy that it felt like there wasn't enough to breathe. Spirals seemed to twirl on the walls as if to catch Elias's eye and draw in his brain. The chanting grew louder as he climbed. It was the same language he had heard in his vision, and it vibrated through the tower like a living thing. He reached the top of the tower, where he found the source. A great glowing bell hung from the ceiling, its surface covered in the same spirals that marked his wrist. Under it stood a figure in shadow, its form shifting and writhing as if it were made of smoke. "You have come," the figure said, its voice echoing unnaturally. Elias gripped his knife tightly. "Who are you? What do you want?" The figure laughed, a sound that sent chills down Elias's spine. "I am the keeper of the pact, and I want what was promised." Elias's mind raced. The book had mentioned a pact made centuries ago, but the details were vague. Whatever it was, it had bound the village to this curse. "You don't have to do this," Elias said, trying to keep his voice steady. "The pact can be undone." The figure took a step closer, its crimson eyes ablaze with fire. "The pact cannot be undone. It can only be fulfilled." The bell began to swing. Its motion was slow, deliberate. Elias felt the air around him grow heavy, and the spirals on his wrist burned with an intensity that made him cry out in pain. He knew he had to do something. He got into his satchel and pulled out the vial of holy water. Silently asking for prayer, he cast it at the figure. Hissing sound echoed as vial broke upon contact as the figure let out its deafening roar, in which the form flickers like a dying flame. Elias didn't hesitate. He rushed forward, knife raised. He struck with all his strength at the base of the bell. The bell let out an ear-piercing toll, the sound so powerful that it shook the entire tower. The figure screamed, its form disintegrating into a cloud of black smoke. But the bell kept swinging, its motion growing faster and more erratic. Elias realized with horror that he hadn't stopped it. He had triggered the final toll. The tower began to collapse around him, the walls crumbling as the bell's toll reached a crescendo. Elias stumbled to his knees, the mark on his wrist glowing brighter than ever. In that instant, he knew. The mark did not curse him, it unlocked him. With his last drop of strength, he clapped his hand on the bell. The light from the mark spread over its surfaces, devouring the spires in a blinding flash. The toller stopped. The tower stilled. Elias went down, his vision fading as the world receded into darkness. When Elias opened his eyes, he found himself in the clearing. The tower was nowhere to be seen, now only a pile of rubble. It was quiet, and that heavy feeling that seemed to settle over the village had gone. He stumbled back into Aurenfeld, his body weak but his head clear. The villagers awaited him, their faces fear and hope mixed together. "It's over," Elias said, his voice hoarse. "The curse is broken." Father Anselm stepped forward, placing a hand on Elias's shoulder. "You've saved us, but at what cost?" Elias looked down at his wrist. The mark was gone, but he felt its absence keenly. The village was safe, but he knew the echoes of the end would haunt him forever.